We're really pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Samantha Bennett to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Dr. Bennett is currently senior lecturer at the Australian National University, where she teaches undergraduate programs in music recording and production techniques, music and digital media, and the culture and politics of popular music. She received her PhD in popular music recording and production techniques at the University of Surrey in 2010, and her book, Modern Records Maverick Methods, Technology and Process in Contemporary Record Production, will be published by Michigan University Press. We were very excited about her proposal when it came across our desks, as we have a long-standing interest in record production and recording technology in our archival collections here, in our education programs, and of course by inducting a long line of producers as Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, from Sam Phillips to Glenn Johns, Jerry Wexler to Alan Toussaint, George Martin to Chris Blackwell. Dr. Bennett will be exploring the recordists in rock production of the 1990s, such as Jim Scott, Rick Rubin, William Orbit, and Steve Albini, among many others. So please welcome to Cleveland and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum, Dr. Samantha Bennett. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I just have a few words of thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank Bob Judd from the American Musicological Society. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to give such an unashamedly rockist lecture tonight. Thanks to Jason Hanley as well from the Rock Hall, all of the logistics and organisation of the trip and making me feel so welcome. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And Ivan Sheehan, who's just posted up a blog post on the Rock Hall website that kind of complements this talk that I'm giving this evening. Thank you to him. And special thanks to Jenny Thomas for all of her help yesterday in pulling things from the archive. It was such an amazing and productive day. I wish I could move in here. And you know what, maybe I will. So I also owe my deepest gratitude to my doctoral supervisor, Professor Alan Moore, who's at the University of Surrey and author of some great books, Rock the Primary Text, Song Means, who set me on this research path in the first place, and students and staff at the School of Music, Australian National University. Hi to them, and thanks for all your support, and particularly my boss, Professor Peter Tregear. Incidentally, he earned his own rock cred stripes last week because he was conducting a choir on stage with the Rolling Stones in Melbourne. So it's been a really rock and roll week for our school, and so do visit us online. Thank you to all of you for joining me tonight in what is such a prestigious venue, and it's a real honour to be here. So thank you so much. And before this turns into something resembling an Academy Award acceptance speech, I should get on with some phonomusicology. Okay, so off we go. In recent times, phonomusicological studies, such as Mark Cunningham's Good Vibrations, Albin Zach's Poetics of Rock, Greg Milner's Perfecting Sound Forever, have made significant progress in filling the scholarly void existing between popular music performance and reception. The impact of the recordist, the recording workplace, and the recording technologies on popular music has been recognised by many scholars, particularly those contributing to the Art of Record Production Forum. And within this emergent discourse, socio-cultural and analytical texts have reinforced a recordist canon of sorts. Scholarly work is dominated by 1950s and 1960s recordists, such as George Martin, Phil Spector, Brian Wilson, and Joe Meek. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees Tom Dowd, Berry Gordy Jr., Les Paul, and Sam Phillips, the latter three are depicted here on screen, also belong to this established recordist canon. These are the pioneers of maverick recording methodologies, responsible for shaping the sound of classic rock and roll. Their work not only forms the underpinning of rock music's sonic characteristics, but also represents an oft-imitated body of audible stylistic, genre, and aesthetic recording principles. Despite retrospective acknowledgement, sound recordists and their contributions to classic rock recordings remain concealed, both in a literal sense as they partake in the recording process, and indeed in popular music historiography. In his 2010 article, Pay Some Attention to the Man Behind the Curtain, Alan Williams recognised what he called the canonisation of process playing out in the Classic Albums documentary series. That being the sonically discernible technological and processual patterns existing in classic rock records. For example, the illumination of individual components of multi-track recordings. We see recordists soloing and muting different aspects of the multi-track on the console, and dry vocal takes prior to effects processing. Stories of technological obstacles overcome, the artist-producer relationships, and the creative yet challenging trajectory of a rock recording from conception through to realization. In rock music historiography, if acknowledged at all, the recordist is often noted by way of association, that being the fame level of the artists he or she recorded. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the retrospective recognition of Abbey Road recordists. The autobiography titles say it all. George Martin's All You Need Is Ears, Ken Scott's From Abbey Road to Ziggy Stardust, Norman Smith's John Lennon Called Me Normal, and Jeff Emmerich's My Life Recording the Beatles. The life works of these recordists are contextualized by the notoriety of a single artist. More recently, academic works including Andrew Lation's book Reformatted, Elliot Bates's article What Studios Do, and Susan Schmidt-Horning's Chasing Sound have shifted the focus onto the recording workplace. Documentary films such as Sound City and Muscle Shoals have reinforced a studio canon of sorts. Gold Star, Sun, Hitsville, USA, and Abbey Road. These are the locations where classic albums were made. And to use a Walter Benjamin term, the aura of the studio is captured in the recording, which of course then comes loaded with its own context, locality, history, and arguably authenticity. So on the one hand, recognition of the production process has come a long way. The once concealed aesthetic influence of technology, recordist, and workplace on what we eventually hear has been slowly revealed. But on the other, these important facets of rock recording are often viewed, particularly on film, through a sepia-toned nostalgic lens. They depict a golden age of recording, a sentimental longing for a music industry past. Sound recording protocol, as defined by progressions in sound engineering research, the post-war quest for high-fidelity audio, the historical trajectory of equipment manufacturing, is documented and disseminated in multiple ways. For example, publications and standards released by the Audio Engineering Society, and more recently by Germany's Fraunhofer Institute. Operational instructions issued by technology manufacturers, audio engineering conferences, the collective gravitational pull toward particular technologies by particular groups of recordists. Sound science books, such as those by John Borwick, Huber and Runstein, Bartlett and Bartlett. Audio engineering pedagogy, the music technology and audio industry press, Sound on Sound, Mix. Online discussion fora of audio equipment and software manufacturers. These combine to reinforce quite a conservative and rules-based recording methodology with little room for individuality, creative interpretation, or artistic appropriation, and so form both technologies and processes deemed standards. Earlier this year, I was researching British post-punk band Susie and the Banshees. In their biography, bassist and songwriter Stephen Severin described an occasion where the band's recordist, Mike Hedges, placed condoms on SM58 microphones, which he then positioned in buckets of water around the studio to capture a unique ambience whilst the band recorded their takes. The point is that techniques like Severin describes are nowhere to be found in engineering handbooks. So paradoxically, recordists that have not conformed to the formulaic principles of audio engineering appear to be the most revered in popular music historiography, those that have broken the boundaries of what is possible in sound recording and production, those who perceived their then cutting-edge tools as creatively limiting and requiring modification, those whose techniques were deemed so unique, so sonically distinctive, so eccentric perhaps, that their place in music history and in wider popular culture is equal to that of many musicians. The inductions of our recordists here to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum is indeed testament to this. Some of their radical, experimental, and at times rebellious production techniques, Les Paul's sound on sound, Phil Spector's wall of sound, Sam Phillips' development of slap echo, for example, have reinformed a continuum of established rock production standards. The result of all of this is two conflicting histories of sound and music recording. One that details the science and the science of sound and technology, the principles, the protocol, the research driving technological change. The other, commending and canonizing those who worked against it, the artistic innovation, their creative abuses, their unorthodox methodologies. Examples of such maverick recordists exist throughout rock history, and so today it's my intention to illustrate works by later recordists, those who have contributed to the sound of later Hall of Fame inductees. Specifically, a few key themes permeate recordist discourse, an emergent area of popular music studies. And whilst I don't have time to cover them all, that is unless we keep the archive open until about 2 a.m., a few are particularly relevant to tonight's talk. One key concept which derives from film theory is auteurism, that a producer's role is akin to that of a film director. Early studies such as Charlie Gillett's paper on the producer as artist, as well as later works including Evan Eisenberg's Recording Angel, both consider the music producer as auteur. For example, Gillett stated in his 1977 work, in much the same way that in films, the film is the work of the director and the star simply does what he is told by the director, so in music. In the late 1970s, the role of the producer may have been easier to ascertain, but auteur theory is problematic due to the largely collaborative nature of recording and production. Additionally, the presence of business and economic personnel, managers, A&R executives, distributors in the life cycle of a record dictates that artists, and indeed recordists, have varying degrees of creative control. Later on, auteur theory evolved into a less direct correlation to film roles, and more, as Paul Watson explained, a critical strategy for sorting the artistic wheat from the generic chaff. Naturally, canons form and groups of significant recordings, artists, albums, and personnel emerge. It's not my intention to formulate a 1990s recordist canon here. Moreover, to exemplify the continuum of recording techniques in an often overlooked area, and to recognize the contribution made by recordists to these later Hall of Fame inductees' music. Another key area is the consideration of the recording studio as musical instrument and/or compositional tool. By the mid-20th century, popular music recording techniques had assimilated avant-garde and radiophonic practices, particularly composite tape editing. The manipulation of analog tape, looping, altering the speed, sampling of found sounds, as well as analog synthesis composition, ensured recording devices were not simply carriers of music, they could be compositional tools in their own right. The Beatles' White Album, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, Frank Zappa's We're Only In It for the Money, these albums demonstrate the use of recording technologies as musical instruments. The same can be said for the digital sampler in the 1980s. Public Enemy's A Nation of Millions, Beastie Boys' Paul's Boutique, De La Soul's 3 Feet High and Rising would not have been possible without the application of a sound recording device as a compositional tool. Another issue pertains to the establishment of analytical method. Musicologists have long pondered matters of arrangement, structure and form, melody, harmony, key signatures and texture. In pop and rock studies, analyses extend to the interplay between music and lyrics, person and persona, performance and reception. At the turn of the 1980s, popular musicologist Philip Tagg devised a methodology of 7 musical expressions to include aspects of time, melody, orchestration, and texture. At this embryonic point in the discourse, Tagg recognized dynamics, acoustics, and electromusical mechanical aspects of the music to be of equal importance to traditional musical form. Tagg's work outlined popular music studies as a socio-cultural field, and the majority of work in the discipline is fixed to a cultural theoretical starting point. Later, Albin Zak pointed out the problematic nature of applying existing musicological analytical method, as he suggested, among the problems inherent in establishing an academic discipline aimed at illuminating record production, then, is the need for a fundamental aesthetic reorientation as well as new modes of analytic description. We must resist reducing musical meaning to matters of musical syntax, which stipulates a de facto hierarchy of aesthetic value. Today's case studies use what I call a tech processual mode of analysis, that being the use of sound recording language, dynamic range, frequency spread, the presence of multitracking and/or overdubbing, the spatial positioning of instruments within a stereo field, and the gestural decisions of the recordist to elucidate the production as opposed to the song. However, a sound recording practice varies widely according to style, genre, tradition, and artist direction. Grounding such tech processual analysis in the wider context of aesthetic intention is vital, and a significant factor influencing such intention lies in recordists' attitude towards their technologies and processes. Aside from Timothy Warner's seminal book, Pop Music, Technology and Creativity, scholarship on 80s and 90s popular music production is relatively emergent and so quite scarce. And so exists what I perceive as an area full of potential discovery. Significant technological change occurred in both decades, and a wealth of new pop and rock genre emerged. The research undertaken for my forthcoming book, Modern Records, Maverick Methods, included detailed analysis of interview material, studio ethnography, and further primary interviews, as well as examining existing recordist autobiographies and a wealth of online resources. The standpoints of around 50 recordists, all working in commercial popular music recording, were analysed. In an attempt to get to the bottom of what motivates recordists, and by that I mean producers, engineers, programmers, artist-producer role conflations, patterns began to emerge among their discussions. Indeed, the attitudes of recordists, their standpoints towards the interactions with artists, technologies, and workplaces is a vital yet rarely acknowledged aspect of the production process. Such attitudes affect technological choices, processual techniques, and have a significant bearing on overall aesthetic intention and creative direction. Indeed, recordists are often sought precisely for their aesthetic preferences, a crucial understanding or match between the stylistic attributes of artist and recordist is regularly sought by both parties and considered an important part of establishing a cohesive and shared direction. And so this diagram illustrates a range of recordist attitudes towards new technologies and emergent processes in the 80s and 90s. I should note that these viewpoints are flexible. Recordists often express one or more views prone to change depending on type of project, point in time or era of working, and the artist or performer aesthetic direction. Scholars such as Mark Cunningham, Alan Durant, and myself have already recognized a sort of technological divide existing amongst recordists in the 80s, loosely along the lines of traditionalist recordists, sticking to tried and tested, often analog domain-centric methods of the 60s and 70s on the one hand. For example, Beatles recordist George Martin suggested later in the 90s, "I think technology is making music boring. You hear the same sounds over and over again. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think the sound of a natural instrument is best. One of the dangers of all this technology and eternal synthesized sound and programming and mechanics is that it's making music a bit sterile." And on the other side, we have what I've called the technophiliacs, those who embrace technological change through the decade and worked with emergent recording devices, often in the digital domain. Consider this contrasting quote from Buggles and Frankie Goes to Hollywood recordist Trevor Horn. "So when digital came along, it was like a manna from heaven for me. It was wonderful because it meant you could do all kinds of things without losing quality." Attitudes towards the changing tech processual landscape resulted in both positive and negative standpoints amongst recordists. However, what's going on in this central grey area is more complex. This is the area where today's case study recordists feature, those who were or are not clear-cut traditionalists or technophiliacs, or indeed entirely positive or negative in their tech processual view. The daredevils, rebels and skeptics, the risk-averse, trepidatious, or even nonchalant. So moving this discussion into 90s practice and using Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees as case studies, here's 4 examples of how non-conformity to either of these positions led to some of the most successful music in that decade. In The Art of Recording and the Aesthetics of Perfection, Andy Hamilton suggested, a perfectionist aesthetic of recording aims to screen out allegedly contingent imperfections of live performance. He went on to explain imperfectionist recording as purist, in wanting to maintain the diachronic and synchronic integrity of the performance, which perfectionist recording creatively subverts. The recording of Nirvana's In Utero album, from which this first case study track, Heart-Shaped Box, derives, is a good example of the imperfectionist aesthetic that Hamilton describes. The album was recorded by Chicago-based recordist Steve Albini at Pachyderm Studios, Minnesota, in February 1993, over a 2-week period. So a little background context. Albini's recordings prior to and following In Utero feature a sonically discernible signature style, placing him at the very forefront of alternative and underground music recording over the last 3 decades. Albums such as Pixie's Surfer Rosa, PJ Harvey's Rid of Me, and later Manic Street Preacher's Journal for Plague Lovers feature natural, prominent drums, dry vocals with little to no processing, and a large room ambience. Albini asserts he is not a producer, yet his recording style is so distinctive he is often incorrectly referred to as a producer in rock historiography. A 2013 deluxe edition of In Utero contained a letter Albini sent to Nirvana prior to their agreement to work together, in which he set out his recording philosophy. This is a particularly significant artifact and revealed the recordist's desire to put the musicians and their natural live sound at the very forefront of the record. Albini played down his role of recordist and emphasized the musicians, the songs, and performances as he wrote, "Predicating the recording with my tastes is as stupid as designing a car around the upholstery." He went on to say, "I like to leave room for accidents and chaos. Making a seamless record where every note and syllable is in place and every bass drum beat is identical is no trick. Any idiot with the patience and budget to allow such foolishness can do it." Here, Albini sets out his manifesto against technological intervention in the recording process and the sound of what he later referred to as an age of overproduction in the 1980s, when engineers and producers were allowed to, in his words, horribly scar music. Yet in referencing chaos, and incidentally, a Polaroid shot of Albini smiling with his shoes on fire was sent along with the letter, Albini's techniques do not fit comfortably into a traditionalist or a music-first kind of approach. Whilst he often expressed technological pessimism, his recording principles also imply rebellion. For example, during a 1994 interview in Music Producers, he stated, "I hate compression. Pounding everything with compression is so standard a trick now that records made without it sound distinctive. That's what keeps me in business." Here, Albini is not only setting out what he believes to be an industry standard practice, but is explicit in his admission of resisting it. His argument is convincing. Standard practice brings about predictable results. Therefore, resistance can produce something individualistic and sonically discernible. Following the recording sessions, the musicians and record company found heart-shaped box problematic and not suited for commercial release. Producer Scott Litt, renowned for his work on REM's Green, Out of Time and Automatic for the People, was then enlisted to remix the track and made a number of significant changes. Albini's original has the snare drum prominent in the mix, with significant contrast between the close-mic'd snare hits and the more ambient rim shots, so that's something to look out for. A dry and very natural single vocal, a particularly abrasive and upfront guitar solo. The distortion effect is reminiscent of Albini's own band, Big Black, and their sound, and a wide dynamic range. Litt's remix, by contrast, features additional backing vocals, with the bass guitar more prominent and the snare drum lower in the mix. The signature guitar solo is less processed, lower in the mix, and the overall level of the track is louder, suggesting a greater use of compression. Litt's version clearly bore the hallmarks of greater technological intervention and processual adaptation, yet Albini's version retained Nirvana's natural performance aesthetics. So here is the much lesser known original Albini version from around the second chorus through the guitar solo to verse 3. No, it isn't. 1 second. Should we try again? consideration of the recording studio as musical instrument and or compositional tool is an intriguing point of focus in phonomusicological study. In The Producer as Composer, Virgil Moorfield considers this concept in the case of producer Brian Eno and his albums Music for Airports and My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. Arguing that Eno uses the studio as a meta-instrument, he states that the studio is score and orchestra rolled into one. A good example of this blurry conflation of the composition and production process lies in this second example, that of U2's Mofo, taken from the 1997 album Pop. Recorded during 95 and 96 at Windmill Lane, Hanover Quay and the Works Studios in Dublin, as well as South Beach Studios in Miami, the album was co-produced by London-based Mark Ellis, more commonly known as Flood, and Howie B. Following early 1980s recording apprenticeships, Flood gained engineering credits on Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' From Her to Eternity, Erasure's The Circus, and Depeche Mode's Shake the Disease. In 1986, he engineered U2's The Joshua Tree with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois as producers. But by the mid-1990s, Flood's creative, boundary-pushing production style had already resulted in some of the most sonically distinctive records of the decade. 9 Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral, Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, and U2's Zooropa. All three featured complex combinations of live and programmed rhythm, samples and loops, prominent and processed vocal performances, as well as the extensive use of multi-tracking and overdubs. These records were constructed from multiple performance edits as opposed to captured whole. As a recordist, Flood's outlook does not conform to a traditional or technology-driven production aesthetic. Moreover, his unorthodox techniques and commitment to experimentation express freedom from standard methodology. Like Albini, Flood has expressed a rebellious attitude when questioned on technology and use value, as he stated in the 90s. What's to stop PJ Harvey sticking a guitar through a VCS3 analog synthesizer? Nothing. What's to stop Nitzareb going for total rock-out guitars against a full-on analog sequencer? Nothing. So cross-fertilization and trying different things is important. If you do a remix, what's to stop you shoving a guitar through a ring modulator? Whilst Flood had worked with U2 prior to Pop, Howie B had not. His mid-1990s remix work with Bjork and Tricky, however, placed him at the center of an emergent genre of European electronica and trip-hop. In the production of U2's Mofo, Flood and Howie B were handed an opportunity to transform a rock song into drum and bass and industrial-inspired electronica. Using technologies more at home in the mid-1980s, they used guitar samples, some of which had been time-stretched or played through an ARP 2600 synthesizer, looped acoustic and synthesized drum patterns, applied layers of time-based signal processing and bandpass filters to the vocal samples, whilst at times manually shifting individual instruments as well as entire sections of the track to the extremities of the stereo field. In a 1997 article, Paul Tingen stated, Mofo, like the rest of Pop, was recorded using samplers and a small amount of sequencing was done using Creator's C-Lab software on an Atari ST. As Howie B explained, we also used an Atari MTR-90 multitrack tape machine with mainly a 1972 Neve desk. But the extent of spatial positioning throughout Mofo elucidates the application of this vintage mixing console as performance tool, as Flood suggested later in 1997. When you have 2 or 3 people sitting at a desk doing a mix, pushing and pulling and changing the music, it becomes like a performance. In the following excerpt of Mofo, we hear a showcase of composite sample editing. Drum loop snippets fly into the mix and suddenly disappear. The heavily processed guitars are not complete performances. Moreover, sample snippets triggered from a MIDI keyboard. Analog synth patches appear at the extremities of the stereo field, and the vocal, in contrast to albums such as the Joshua Tree, is very low in the mix throughout. So in this excerpt, we're listening to Flood and Howie B's construction approach in the introduction of the song. The idea of a sonic signature, that being the orally discernible imprint of the recordist, their technological and processual impact upon a music recording, is a point of focus in phonomusicology. In his paper, Creative Ownership and the Case of the Sonic Signature, or I'm Listening to This Record and Wondering Who Done It, Bob Davis suggests the identification of tech processual imprints in recorded music is a form of musicological forensics. Many investigative or detective-like approaches exist, such as the use of recordist interviews, documentary films, photographs, and artist biographical anecdotes. But these are most useful when synthesized with primary analysis. Timothy Warner's work on Trevor Horn is a good example. Davis goes on to argue a sonic signature as the potential for a sound to carry the identity of an individual. William Orbit is one such recordist whose sonic signature requires little detective work. After founding London's Guerrilla Studios in the 1980s and establishing himself as a remix engineer for artists as varied as Belinda Carlisle, Malcolm McLaren, and The Cure, Orbit ventured into his own compositional production work with the release of his ambient electronica Strange Cargo series in the 1990s. But by the middle of the decade, Orbit had crafted a distinct sonic signature via his use of vintage analog synthesizers, Akai samplers, and use of an old version of Cubase on an Atari 1040 ST computer, as he described in 1998. Most of my equipment is pretty retro: a Korg MS-20, a Roland Juno 106, a Roland JD800. I've got a few modules, a Yamaha DX7 synthesizer, a Novation bass station, a Roland JP8000. Such a keyboard-centric collection is quite unusual for somebody who also declared, "I don't consider myself a keyboardist at all. I'm a two-fingered virtuoso, and I can't read or write music." By the late 1990s, hard disk recorders and increasingly sophisticated digital audio workstations were the norm in commercial record production. Yet Orbit remained indifferent to this technological change and worked in a kind of operational bubble. Consider this comment taken from a 1996 interview with Sound on Sound. Orbit tells the interviewer, "I'm sorry, I haven't the faintest idea how to work many of the things I see in your magazine. I just haven't got the time to get into them." Orbit's indifference to the changing technological and processual times manifested in what would become his biggest commercial achievement. In producing Madonna's Ray of Light, Orbit centered the production around his collection of technological anachronisms. As he pointed out, "I mean, Picture Madonna, the biggest pop star in the world, playing with this retro gear that you can buy for $50 in the recycler. Orbit's construction of Ray of Light involved painstakingly recording analog synthesis excerpts to analog tape, then sampling them back from the tape and programming them into a sequencer, as he stated in 1998. I record stuff to tape in a really ad-lib fashion. I just get the gear going and perform it to tape. But the key is that I subsequently go back, load the best bits into the sampler, and further manipulate it. You get the best of both worlds that way. This conflation of analog recording with MIDI sampling and sequencing techniques formed a key part of Orbit's sonic signature. Orbit captured a natural analog aesthetic before arranging and further manipulating the samples in the digital domain. Unaware of the Atari 1040 ST's near obsolescence, Orbit's antiquated equipment raised eyebrows during the production process, as he mentioned. I didn't know that the use of the Atari was unusual until about 2/3 of the way through, when people would comment on it. At one point, the thing even caught fire. Really? There's smoke coming out of it. It was like, what's that smell? Oh, it's burning components. What we have here is a less out-and-out rebellious recording approach, but an idiosyncratic methodology, uninformed by then-current standards. In this excerpt, we hear William Orbit's blissfully nonchalant, unique record construction approach manifest in an immediate, spaced-out sonic signature. Multiple two-note synth loops adorn the prominent kick drum pattern, synth filter sweeps are panned around the stereo field, and the presence of synthesis results in an unusually wide frequency spread for a popular recorded song. Orbit's vocal processing combination of large room reverb and delay blends Madonna's natural flowing performance into a mix full of freedom, spontaneity, and a sense of improvisation. Ray of Light is in fact a cover of Dave Curtis and Clive Muldoon's 1972 folk track, Sephirin. Orbit's version bears almost no resemblance to the original. The production showcases a unique electronic composer recordist tasked with Madonna's sonic reinvention. In his seminal 1985 book, Noise, The Political Economy of Music, Jacques Attali suggested, recording has always been a means of social control, a stake in politics, regardless of the available technologies. Possessing the means of recording allows one to monitor noises, to maintain them, and to control repetition within a determined code. One such recordist, renowned for shaping rock, hip-hop, and metal over the last 3 decades, is Rick Rubin, co-founder of the Def Jam label and recordist for artists as varied as Run DMC, Slayer, and Johnny Cash. Historically, Rubin has positioned himself as an executive producer, more concerned with song quality and a record's overarching sonic aesthetic, as opposed to the technological means through which that may be achieved. Some artists have been critical of Rubin's production style. For example, on accepting an award in 2010, rock band Muse thanked Rubin for teaching us how not to produce. But despite Rubin's lack of technological input, he employs experienced recordists to engineer sessions. His recordings follow a distinct, determined code that Atali refers to. Beastie Boys' License to Ill, Slayer's Rain in Blood, and Jay-Z's Black Album, for example, feature a loud and punchy song-centric approach, emphasizing vocal performances and heavy guitar tracks. Yet Rubin's records retain a sense of underproduction, that being the presence of multi-tracking, overdubs, and editing is quite minimal. And it was precisely this aesthetic that led him to further successful recording partnerships with artists such as Johnny Cash and Tom Petty. Californication, which was Rubin's 3rd album with Red Hot Chili Peppers, was recorded at Ocean Way Studios in Hollywood during 5 weeks in 1999. Rubin's input centered on the songwriting, lyrics, and arranging. The band recorded 30 tracks, from which 15 were chosen for the album. At the turn of the millennium, recording technology at Ocean Way was primarily analogue and home to one of the world's largest collection of vintage tube microphones. Other Side exemplifies a traditional, performance-oriented recording with all musicians recording simultaneously. The drums were placed on a raised platform in the center of Ocean Way's live room. Vocalist Anthony Kiedis sang in a small vocal booth, and Flea and John Frusciante's amplifiers were isolated from the other instruments. The members of the band were no more than 10 feet away from each other at any one time during the recording. The album was recorded to an Ampex 24-track tape machine via a 1970s Neve 8038 desk. No Dolby noise reduction was used on this recording, as both the band and the producer wanted to keep the hiss in to retain an analog aesthetic. Other vintage equipment, such as a Uri 1176 compressor, was used throughout the album. The upfront instrumental presence was achieved by close miking the instruments and using little to no ambient or room microphones. Additionally, aside from a few drum tracks, the album is entirely mono, with all instruments positioned in the center of the stereo field. This is reminiscent of the Def Jam recording aesthetic that Rubin and Russell Simmons crafted in the early 1980s. As engineer Jim Scott suggested, mono helps to keep things loud. We decided that we didn't want things suddenly blasting from the left channel. Why would we want that? We just want to hear the songs. Yet Californication, and Other Side in particular, were the subject of criticism surrounding what some believed was excessive compression. Interestingly, 2 types of noise are present. The recording features an audible hiss from the analog tape and lack of noise reduction, which is unusual for a record made at the turn of the millennium. However, more significantly, the track features much dynamic range reduction, contains static noise throughout, and a notable low-frequency absence, leading some in the industry to conclude that Californication was a casualty of the loudness war. This is an example of traditionalist classic rock production, complete with the vintage recording tools brought kicking and screaming into the new millennium.
How long spend, slitting my throat, it's all I ever. I heard your voice through a photograph. I thought that I've been brought up the past. Oh, once you know you can never go back, I gotta take it on the other side. The centuries are what it meant to me. A cemetery where I marry the sea. A stranger thing that never changed.
In his 2003 book, Pop Music Technology and Creativity, Timothy Warner suggested, pop music is inextricably linked to technology. It is realized with technology. The wide range of devices that constitutes the modern recording studio, and it's also perceived through technology. As audio technology develops, so pop music changes, yet the ways in which technology permeates pop music have received relatively scant attention. Warner's observations recognize, from a determinist perspective, the correlations between technological change and the developing sound of popular music. In the 60s and 70s, when recording technology centered on analog tape, there was a distinct correlation between then current technological development, for example, the increasing track capabilities of analog tape recorders, and the equipment used to make commercially successful recordings, quite simply because there was no alternative. The introduction of digital technologies at the turn of the 1980s, such as the Fairlight CMI, the synclavier, MIDI samplers, synthesizers and sequencers, digital audio tape recorders, created a kind of technological divide in the industry, as previously discussed. The 90s, however, became an era of technological mashup. By that time, elite analog recording systems of the 1970s became more affordable and available on the second-hand market. 1980s digital systems such as the Sony Dash digital tape recorders, DAT machines and MIDI systems were precursors by the 1990s, having been superseded by hard disk recording systems and continually improving digital audio workstations. Yet the most successful rock recordists of the decade appeared unaffiliated to these cutting-edge systems. On the contrary, Steve Albini recorded in Utero wholly within the analog domain. Flood and Howie B used their vintage Neve console in conjunction with outdated MIDI samplers and synthesizers to create U2's techno-inspired sound. William Orbit continued to use his 1040 ST and various analog synthesizers, and Rick Rubin and Jim Scott captured Red Hot Chili Peppers with a range of vintage microphones through an early 70s analog console. Whilst these recordings are diverse in terms of sonic character, they each demonstrate recordist resistance to work within current tech processual practice and therefore challenge obsolescence. A recordist's sonic signature can be difficult to ascertain, particularly when their recordings fall across a breadth of style, genre and tradition. Historically, artists have deliberately sought out recordists with distinctive and recognizable sonic signatures. Throughout her career, Madonna has consistently and methodically matched her musical ideas with a strong recordist signature, whether that be Jelly Bean Benitez's early 1980s disco pop production, or into the 2000s Maves Armadzi's progressive EDM sound. At the time of Ray of Light, William Orbit was a remix engineer and yet to establish himself in a full producer's role. Unsurprising then that he found the sudden change in technological and processual expectations intimidating, as he said of the Ray of Light sessions. Larrabee was a real state-of-the-art studio. I'd never even worked on an automated desk before. It wasn't so much as a learning curve as a learning cliff. I realized right away that my equipment was really superannuated, like my old Atari held together with gaffer tape. It took William Orbit many years to accept his working practices as unorthodox. As he said in 2009, "I tried to sound like other people for so long, but I can't do it. I'm all over the place, but I accepted that." Computers can give you that freedom. You don't have to see music as dots on a page, and you can break free of convention. Whilst Orbit does not display the same rebellious anti-mainstream attitude as Steve Albini or Flood, his working practices are still intentionally unconventional. And it was precisely this maverick methodology that allowed Madonna to reinvent herself at a critical stage in her career. In other instances, a recordist can force an artist into an alternative creative direction, taking them outside of their comfort zone and subsequently impacting a record's overall aesthetic. In Niall Stokes' book, U2, The Stories Behind Every Song, which I accessed yesterday here at the Library and Archives, bassist Adam Clayton admitted that the last resort ideas for Mofo were placed in Flood's hands. As he said, "We spent months probably farting around with it, and then Bono said, 'Let's give it one more night.' So we said to Flood, 'Let's hip-hop it. Let's strip it back. Let's get a beat together. Let's see where it goes.' And it rose from those ashes." Flood corroborated this and responded, "Mofo had started as a traditional-esque R&B kind of song, and there was actually a finished version that people were quite happy with. But I always felt there was more to it than that, and I was the one who was pushing them to go further. So one weekend, me and Howie set about deconstructing it, and it sort of mutated on from there." It is, however, not simply the sonic signature that attracts artists to recordist. Often, recordists act as authenticators. They come loaded with their own historical, political, geographic, and cultural meaning. So Californication, for example, is not simply a Red Hot Chili Peppers album. Whilst Rick Rubin brought his production skills to the recording, he brings with him the history of Def Jam Records, 2 decades of critical and mainstream success across rock, hip-hop and metal genre, and a proven ability to craft song ideas into hit records. In Jake Brown's book, Red Hot Chili Peppers in the Studio, and which again I had not encountered this text before yesterday, that was the result of some research I did here at the archives, guitarist John Frusciante described Rubin's contribution to Californication. He plays a big part in the construction of the songs. He helps the arrangements. The harmony vocals weren't even my idea, but Rick Rubin's. Rubin's impact on later recordings was perhaps even greater. For example, at the end of 2004 single 99 Problems, Jay-Z acknowledges his producer, "You're crazy for this one, Rick. It's your boy." Rubin also appears with Jay-Z throughout the Mark Romanek directed video. The recording of Heart-Shaped Box illustrates the tension between underground and or alternative and commercial musics. And as such, the single version is a rare example of independent and mainstream hybridity. In Rob Jovanovich's book, Nirvana, The Recording Sessions, and again, that was a text that I managed to access yesterday here at the archive, Nirvana bassist Chris Novoselic outlined the band's reason for choosing Albini as their recordist. "We didn't want to be sellouts, and Albini is known for having integrity." Following their commercially successful 1991 album Nevermind, Nirvana clearly sought to return to their underground roots. Steve Albini, with historical, cultural, and musical links to independent music, was the perfect authenticator. Unsurprising then was Albini's reluctance to alter Heart-Shaped Box into a commercially viable, radio-friendly mix, on the request of both band and label. Albini stated in Jovanovich's book, "I worked on that record and I felt close to it. I felt like it sounded better before any tinkering was done. When they sent me a copy, I put it on and instantly I was disappointed in the mastering. The dynamic range was narrowed. The stereo width was narrowed. There was a lot of mid-range boost EQ added, and the whole overall sound quality was softened. And the bass response was compromised to make it sound more consistent on the radio and the home speaker. but the way I would describe it in non-technical terms is that they fucked it up. At a time when computer-based digital audio workstations were fast becoming the norm, many sound recordists of this era either rejected the new direction outright or blended technological and processual precursors into unconventional and individualized working practices. Such recording reinventions mirrored those of our 1950s and 60s canon. It is, however, important to reassert the fluid nature of sound recording and music technology practice, whilst recognizing that technologies change, techniques change, recordists' tech processual ideologies change. What may have been considered unorthodox in one sound recording era and or instance is another recordist or future standard. But what hasn't changed is the success and recognition of recordists working outside of standardized practice, no matter what the era or genre, and whether that be to skepticism, risk aversion, nonchalance, blissful ignorance, rebellion, or simply a commitment to individual creative expression. And with that, I'll open the floor to questions. So thank you very much.
All right, I will bring the mic around. We'd like you to speak into the mic so we can get it on the stream and record it. So I will bring the mic around and we'll have time for everyone, I think. Jack.
Thank you. That was a very learned and comprehensive presentation. Thank you very much. I'm glad I was here.
Thank you.
It used to be that you had to have a lot of money to record. You had to buy equipment.
Yeah.
And now about any 14-year-old with an iPad and a couple of apps can create something brand new, publish it to YouTube or to Facebook or something else.
That's right.
What do you see the impact on creativity, especially with kids who don't know the rules, who don't have any rules to start with, and really have the tools now to do some pretty incredible things?
Yeah. I mean, I guess what you're referring to is sort of the so-called democratization of music technologies and how, you know, we all get GarageBand shipped on our Macs these days, so everybody's got those tools accessible to them now, which for the, you know, the last kind of 20 or so years, maybe slightly shorter than that, it's been pretty much the first time in history. I mean, I've argued in previous publications that democratization is still quite perceived as opposed to something real, because whilst we've seen a democratization of technology, what we haven't seen is the democratization of skill sets that you also have to have in order to make these kind of records, okay? So, you know, you can't democratize the ability to mic up a drum kit. That takes practice and experiential expertise, and that's precisely why, just because everybody has a digital audio workstation and a free version of GarageBand, that doesn't mean to say we're Rick Rubin overnight or Albini overnight. You know, there is an element of process there that hasn't gone away. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that creativity is often born out of not knowing what you're doing, and that is precisely the example in William Orbit. And he clearly admits, I mean, quite, you know, openly, I don't know what I'm all over the place. I don't know that what I'm doing was unusual, and people comment on my gears catching fire, and it's held together with gaffer tape. But you know, I'm doing what I do and what I think is right. But it's a sound that, you know, Madonna obviously wanted, and then of course it was a sound that other artists wanted, such as U2, All Saints, Blur. And he was one of the most sought-after producers in the world after that record, with this battered-up load of, you know, second-hand equipment, still shipping it around the world in flight cases. So I agree with you in that creativity is often born out of not knowing what you're doing, and the same goes for music too. You know, some of the best music has been made by people who wouldn't know a C from a D, or how to write that down on traditional score. So I certainly agree with that point. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great paper. I wanted to bring up, I had sort of 2 points, and I was wondering what you were thinking of them. The first, like, I get the idea of trying to reclaim the role of the sound recordist in pop music history, and I think that's a great project. But I'm interested in the idea of the term sound recordist.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it as a term sort of conceals the division of labor of what's going on. Like, we talk about sort of producer and engineer, right? The producer, in a very general sense, being the person in the studio working with them, setting up the kits, like doing the thing, and the engineer being the person who's later mixing the album and doing these things. And there's this dichotomy. And in history, we tend to let in the producers, right? All of the people we've talked about at the beginning are all producers. And the role of the engineer is much harder to talk about historically, mainly because people don't know that it exists, I think, or don't know what it does. So my first question was about this sort of dichotomy between producer and engineer in the term. And then jumping off of that, I was thinking about the Steve Albini thing, because Steve Albini always refers to himself as an engineer rather than as a producer, and he specifically is positioning himself that way. And I was thinking that, so Albini's got a manifesto, right? He's got this sort of masculinist ideology. It's very easy to take Albini as a person, right? He's fun. But I'm interested in sort of like Andy Wallace, the guy who engineers Nevermind and adds the pop gene. Yes. Yeah. So the guy who's engineering, he's adding the pop sheen, right? He adds the flange to the guitars. In a similar way that Albini's adding the distortion to the guitars. I see them as sort of being on a spectrum, right? They're different ideas. They're sort of the opposite, but they're part of a continuum of practices that the engineer can do. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts for how we might try and get someone like Andy Wallace into history, as well as Steve Albini.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that there was about 5 or 6 questions in that one question. So if I just can go back a little bit. First of all, you asked about reclaiming the role of the recordist. Albin Zak uses that term in the Poetics of Rock as a kind of conflation between, producers, engineers, programmers, and artists, producers, and so on. Because I think that in the era that I'm talking about here, and I've talked exclusively really about rock music today, but in the book I'm covering lots of other genre, hip-hop, dance music, and so on. The 80s and 90s was an era of great technological and processual change. And in those eras, because of the kinds of technologies that became available, the role of the recordist changed. For example, the impact of an inline mixing console, for example. You had, the channel inputs plus the monitoring in one channel. So therefore that halved the size of the desk, which meant you didn't need a tape-op, because the only reason you needed a tape-op was because the engineer couldn't reach the tape and concentrate on the inputs at the same time. So that had a huge impact. In the same way that the dance music producers of the late 80s, I'm talking about people like Tim Simonon from Bomb the Bass, a guy called Gerald, all of those sort of house producers, were the composers and the performers and the producers themselves. So recordist again becomes a really quite a useful term, because otherwise what we're doing is we're saying, well, he's a producer and she's an engineer and this is a mix engineer, when often, particularly in the confines of this era, which is my focus, those roles were very, very blurred. We talk about Rick Rubin as a producer, but there are a lot of artists who say he doesn't produce, he just lays on a couch and listens. And when he thinks he hears something that they could try, he'll say so. Whereas somebody like George Martin, who historically we've thought of as a producer, was very much more hands-on. So therefore, where do you draw the line? It becomes very, very tricky to actually pin down the sort of the kind of individual sort of aesthetics of each of those individual roles, particularly as they've changed through history. I think it was much easier to make the distinction between producer and engineer in the 60s and the 70s, because then those roles were very, very clearly defined. But from the 1980s onwards, there were so many conflations. I mean, somebody like Prince Paul, who produced the De La Soul records, he was a DJ. Pete Waterman was a DJ turned producer. So then where do they sit in production? Do you know what I mean? So recordist becomes a very, a much more flexible term for us to use in the context of these eras. So that's the first point. And again, the division of labour, well, in some instances, there is no division of labour. I mean, so for example, another 90s recordist that I look at in modern records is Norman Cook, Fatboy Slim, who was the writer, the sampler, the programmer, the engineer, the producer, the label owner. Do you know what I mean? He was everything. So to that extent, again, it's a good example of a conflation of roles where there is no division of labour. Yes, I think we do let in producers into this. Into the rock canon. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's a result that we're still very new in terms of popular music studies and popular musicology, for want of a better expression. And so, of course, a good place to start is back at the early sound recordists, Walter Legg, John Coleshaw, etc., and then to move on to the George Martins and the Joe Meeks and the Brian Wilsons. And I just think that as popular music studies sort of evolves, and more people are studying this area, which is quite emergent, then all of those different issues will eventually be dealt with. But I think, we're talking about a discourse that's, really 10, 15 years old. So there's a lot of work to do. Maybe there's a PhD in there for somebody. Should Andy Wallace be recognised in historiography? Yes, I certainly think he should. Absolute pioneer of that whole kind of new metal sound. I mean, the Limp Bizkit records he mixed and the Linkin Park records had a very strong sonic aesthetic to them. And yes, he should. Again, that's someone's PhD, examining the mixes of Andy Wallace. 1990 to 2005. There you go.
Thank you. This is great. So I want to go back to William Orbit. I was really struck by the quotation about him saying, he basically claiming ignorance isn't really the word, but he doesn't know what he's doing.
Nonchalance, I think was the word I used.
He, better than anybody you talked about, fits the auteur label. He knows exactly what he is doing, and what auteurs are best known for is claiming they don't know what they're doing, but doing it to the nth degree. Wes Anderson is the perfect example of this now, where it's like, oh, I just do what I do. But he has everything down to the science, whether it's the font or the color or the costume and everything. And so it's not just that he's self-aware, it's self-fulfilling. He knows exactly what it's going to do, and what made me think about that was Pieces in a Modern Style. So for people who aren't aware of this is an album that Orbit did in 1995, but didn't get re-released in the States until the Madonna album happened by Warner's, and it was him doing classical pieces with his technology, but what he basically was doing was Wendy Carlos from 25 years earlier. But it had this very new sound, except of course he's using the technology that he wasn't using Moogs, but he was just one step away from it. So he's rewriting, he's writing his own history, simultaneously looking forward as I'm the guy who's doing this thing, but also looking back by doing this classical electronic thing that had kind of died a generation before. And of the four people you talk about, he really just fits that, because the other thing is that he's the only one of them who actually has albums under his own name. And so I was just seeing here things like, wow, he really does stand out. And Eno is a good example of someone else who really fits this, where he does his own albums, but he works with everybody else. He's highly sought after, has a sound. And again, it's like, oh, I just do this thing. And I can't, Eno, I think, is a little more, has thought much more about it and has talked much more about it, but they can really be fit together similarly. So I don't know if you want to talk about him standing out as the performer, recordist, auteur?
Yeah, I mean, Brian Eno and William Orbit are two very, very different recordists, and I think it's really difficult because in one sense, just singling out these recordists is espousing auteurism, but that's not really what I want to do, because it is collaborative. It has to be, and at the end of the day, recording processes, yes, we can illuminate them. Yes, we can say, these technologies were used and these processes were used, but we can't completely separate that from the music. It's part of the fabric of it. I disagree that Orbit is an auteur. I mean, for example, Madonna is credited as a co-producer on a lot of those tracks, and it was very much a collaborative effort. And also the way in which that particular track came to be was such a unique story, you just couldn't make it up. I mean, William Orbit was originally working with a girl called Christine Leach, who was one of Curtis and Muldoon's nieces, and she wanted to do a version of Ray of Light as a tribute to her uncle and his folk success in the very early 70s. So Orbit had already started working on it with her. She was in a band called Baby Fox at the time, and they were due to release an album. And then when Madonna started to work with Orbit, she asked, can you send me some tapes of stuff that you're working on? That's what he sent her. So actually Christine Leach and Clive Muldoon, Dave Curtis, they have songwriting credits on that track. So to that extent, it's one of the most collaborative tracks that's probably ever been recorded. I mean, there were also 3 or 4 engineers. Mark Ender was one of them who worked on that record too. So I can't think of Orbit as an auteur. Rubin, however, and his work, maybe particularly back in the 80s, I mean, he was the manager of the record label. He was also the producer. He also, had a lot to do with who he brought into that kind of Def Jam world. That is far more indicative of an auteur type, in the same way that Stock Aitken and Waterman were too. The London producers of Kylie Minogue and Rick Astley and Bananarama and all those kind of bubblegum pop stars of the late 80s, because they were they had the record label and the studio, and they were the producers and the A&R people in one. So if anyone can be considered sort of an auteur, I'd suggest it was kind of the Rubins, the Stock Aitken and Watermans. But even then, it really is a stretch. The pieces in a modern style, there's no doubt that, and particularly the main track of the Barber's Adagio for strings that he released was like this became this kind of techno anthem, and kind of indicative of that 90s Ministry of Sound sort of Ibiza aesthetic. And for sure, he totally capitalised on the success of Ray of Light in order to release his own work, and Strange Cargo series and My Oracle Lives Uptown and everything else. So yes, I think you're right in that he definitely, there was William Orbit before and after Ray of Light. That there are two sort of eras of his career, very, very distinct eras. There was him as this, Guerrilla Studios remix engineer who was doing very well, but freelance in the lead up to it, and then afterwards, producing U2 and Blur and All Saints and travelling the world, and so on, and then giving him a platform to release his own work. But as I said in the final part of this talk, tech processual ideology changes, recordists change. Steve Albini would never have entertained a digital technology back in the 80s or the 90s or even the 2000s, but Electrical Audio has a Pro Tools rig. He's not using it, but his studio has that equipment there. So again, he wouldn't have entertained that back in, 88 or 89 or whatever. So yeah, it's important to know that, that there is a continuum here of practice, and that, recordists change, their ideologies change, their commercial success has a bearing on what they do too.
Right, we have time for one more question right here.
In your opinion, what is the future of music production?
Oh wow, what a great question. That's a great question. I honestly believe that the Rick Rubins and the Steve Albinis and these kind of commercial recordists will still have a place. They still do have a place. We still hear records being mixed by Andy Wallace. We still hear, Rick Rubin producing a record. I don't think that's going to go away. And I think that with this whole, if I can take it back to the first question surrounding this kind of democratization of technology, I just don't think that's going to do away with the role of a commercial record producer. I think there's fewer of them. I think it's harder for producers to establish themselves these days, and part of that is to do with the economy of music. We're in an economy now where where records don't sell in the quantities that they did back then, which means record companies don't have the same kinds of revenues, and that then impacts on how much they can pay for a recording process, and then how much a producer gets paid, and so on and so forth. But yeah, go on.
What do you think, monetization of music, commercialization of music plays in it? Since the declining record sales, music, I feel like has become more of a marketing tool. How do you think that plays into what you're talking about?
I think that's an interesting. I'm not sure that music has become a marketing tool. Has it? I mean, we still.
I feel like more and more with popular music, there is a lack of distinction.
Okay.
Like in the '90s, there were definitely certain production styles. You could hear a producer and know it was them.
Yeah.
But now it seems like producers are chasing a sound that works.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree that music production and technology has become quite homogenized, and we've got this kind of Pro Tools sound where everything sounds like Pro Tools, and again there's another paper that I recently wrote about analog loyalty, and how now technologies that aren't digital audio workstations are being used as sonic differentiators. And this is why you can listen to a radio and anything that Jack White does stands out a mile, because he's recording it on 8-track analog machines from the 1970s. Now, if you do that in an era where everything sounds like Pro Tools, it's just going to leap out of the speakers at you. I think the Foo Fighters did something similar on their last record. They recorded it all to tape. So we're in this kind of strange situation where there are quite a few artists who are starting to look backwards as opposed to forwards. But then, that has always been the case. What's the future? I don't really have that answer. I don't know. But I don't see the Rick Rubins or the Albinis losing their jobs anytime soon. Put it that way.
All right, well, we want to give special thanks to the American Musicological Society for helping us make this possible. I want to thank all of you for coming and for watching online, and let's give Samantha Bennett one last bit of thanks.